My name is Andrea Bridges-Smith, and I'll be your moderator today here at Spanning. We have three great speakers here today who are so knowledgeable and really true experts in the field of cloud security. First of all, we have Jim Rivas, co-founder and CEO of the Cloud Security Alliance. Welcome, Jim. We also have Harold Bune, Senior Director of Product Management at Skyhigh Networks. Welcome, Harold. And finally, we have our own Mike Pav, the VP of Engineering here at Spanning. Welcome, Mike, and thanks to all of you for being here today. So today we're going to talk about 3 ways that you can have an easier time with your audits, which I think everyone would like to do. And the first step towards acing your compliance audits in the cloud is to figure out who you can trust and how you can verify it. I'm going to let Jim Rivas of the Cloud Security Alliance talk more about that and about trust and compliance in global cloud computing systems. Jim?
Thank you very much, Andrea, and welcome everyone who's taken the time out of your busy day to go enjoy this seminar. So Cloud Security Alliance is an organization that's really trying to be at the forefront of solving tomorrow's emerging security issues today as you are moving to cloud. We know that cloud is still, it's a part of the IT landscape, and we're certainly going to be coexisting with a lot of different types of solutions, but more and more from large enterprises. We're hearing that they're moving all in to cloud. Any new IT initiative, they have a cloud-first strategy there, so we think this is of fundamental importance. So CSA, it's a global nonprofit organization. We have people and chapters all around the world, probably near you. We're providing free research. Everything we provide from a research perspective is free because we have great corporate members like Spanning and Skyhigh that helps us be able to do that. So we have a lot of great research. Going to go over a little bit of that. We have a provider certification called CSA Star, a user certification called the CCSK, and really we're for everyone. If you're a customer of cloud, a cloud provider, you're in the audit side and the legal side, there's a place for you in our big tent to collaborate to create these consensus best practices. So let's talk a little bit, just to set this up, a little bit of economics. So we know that a lot of the benefits that people tout about cloud is it's this on-demand compute utility that you don't need to procure the computers. You can just take a credit card and immediately have it available. And that provides these cost efficiencies, and you can have this universal access so that anyone, whether it's your company or your strategic partners, can immediately access an important application. And beyond that, this just democratization of the ability to have access to the largest compute facility in the world, it's creating all sorts of amazing innovations because we really don't have that constraint where computers used to be a constrained resource. Now, to make this work, the interesting thing from an economics perspective is if you're a cloud provider, you need to make this available to the greatest market as possible, meaning if you're a provider, you don't want to just sell in one country or one state or to one industry. You want to be able to sell this pervasively and make your service available all over the world. Now, that's great, but there are definitely some issues to that. So when we think about what that causes is it really creates this fundamental trust issue. So we've heard a lot of it in the news about, hey, what country is my information in? Is that against the law? And that's because we do have, I think at last count, we have over 190 countries. They have different laws. They have different cultures. And you can literally have a challenge of seeing their laws conflict, and you can be in compliance with one and out of compliance with another. So it creates big issues. When we have this fundamental separation from you don't have the blinky lights in your data center and you can't see the compute systems directly, that this separation requires us to understand what is the provider doing? Do we have transparency into what they're doing, what their information security program looks like, where the information is being stored, how backups are being done, and a whole host of issues. And we also know that with DevOps and other trends in agile development, it's no longer that state where the different services are changed with new versions once or twice a year, but in fact several times a day often. There's all these adjustments. So we have these trust issues that we need to figure out how do we get a sustainable compliance program for. So let's ponder that a little bit on what those changes are. So when we think about how cloud and this economics and millions of customers using a specific cloud provider, how that forces compliance changes when you're doing this on a global basis is, one, we think a lot about harmonization of different requirements and not thinking about a single standard. We're just not going to have one cloud security standard. There's going to be several, because countries, politicians, industries, they're going to want to continue to enforce the rules for their specific domain. And so what we think is very strategic is, how do we help you leverage what you've already done in terms of compliance, in terms of an information security management program? And that's by making sure that popular standards and regulations map or relate to each other, so that you can leverage to the maximum extent what you've done already in one. Maybe it's PCI, maybe it's ISO, maybe it's HIPAA, maybe it's something in the European Union, and we can see how that relates to the next thing that you've been tasked with needing to comply towards. We also think that this change in millions and millions of customers is changing how auditing and certification must work, in that you're not going to get all those one-off audits. I think our Mike for certain is going to attest to, and that you are going to have to rely more on certification and on other voices telling you that this particular system meets their standards, and you're going to need to accept that. And we're also going to have challenges with this interrelationship of a software as a service application residing in an infrastructure as a service, and you have this technology stack that actually has a lot of different providers involved in. And so we got to understand, how do we inherit these security controls and not work against each other to break the different security controls that underlying parts of that technology stack have. So some of the other things we think about are the fact that we have some real benefits of cloud and transparency, and the fact that these services are publicly available, that we can actually have the community, social networks, the Twitter sphere tell us if a particular cloud provider is not achieving the security controls we need, or we think there's something they could do better. And this requires us to be vigilant in terms of consumers and security experts, and it also requires those providers to be more transparent. And finally, one of the important things that we think is changing is just this ability to do this in real time. So just as I like to make the analogy, you go to the dentist once or twice a year, but you have to brush your teeth multiple times every day. From a compliance perspective, it's incumbent upon us to do activities between audits, between the issuance of certificates, to actually make sure that we're continuing to comply. And a lot of this is going to require automation, and it's going to be the technology providers that are able to do this. So I just wanted to talk briefly how CSA, again through really free research and building a program to involve partners, is enabling this sustainable compliance and addressing those issues and addressing it on a global level. So we have a program that is called STAR, and it's based on a key piece of research. It's our most popularly downloaded research, and it's called the Cloud Controls Matrix. What this is, it's what we call a meta framework of cloud security controls. We've said these are the controls that are important for cloud providers. These are controls that apply more to software as a service versus infrastructure as a service. These are maybe controls that are more important for the provider or the tenant, or perhaps it's a shared responsibility for a specific security control. And then what we've done is we've mapped this to all the other regulations and standards that you're familiar with and that you need to comply to. And so that is the idea of aligning what you're doing today with the other responsibilities you have as you move to cloud and the emerging requirements that happen. And so then what we've done with that is we've made this the foundation of that STAR program, and it has 3 levels of certification. One, where a provider can do a self-assessment and then publish that information so we can all view it and see what we think about the provider security controls. We have a level 2 where we've partnered with the leaders to create something called STAR certification, which is a version of the ISO 27001 that's actually scoped with the Cloud Controls Matrix. And we also have STAR attestation, which is a version of the very popular, what used to be called SAS 70, done by the AICPA. Now we call it SOC Type 2 reports, again scoped with the Cloud Controls Matrix. And we work directly with the AICPA to create this program. And then finally, something we're releasing in 2015 is the specifications for the continuous monitoring, which we call STAR Continuous, so that providers can have a specific way of publishing this and the protocols so that we can query that on a very consistent basis. And that's going to enable the technology providers like Skyhigh, who are doing a lot of great automation, to do that in this format as well. So we think that provides a pretty good foundation that we have to build upon. We have to use it. We have to integrate this with what we're doing on a global basis. But that gives us that ability to do that sustainable compliance in the cloud globally for any type of cloud provider.
So Jim, it sounds like the CCM and the STAR program are really good tools for vendors to make sure they're operating correctly. But it's also a good way for buyers to evaluate cloud vendors. So thanks for sharing that with us. I do have a quick question for you here. From the perspective of a potential customer trying to evaluate a cloud vendor, what are the differences between the requirements that they might have used to evaluate an on-premises vendor versus the requirements that they should have for a cloud vendor?
Well, a lot of the issues that you see do relate to governance. When you're thinking about something that you're implementing internally, you're typically using your own sort of governance model, and so you may have questions about how does a provider vet its employees, for example. Does it do background checks? And you know, by the way, those are illegal in some areas of the world. So there's a lot of those sort of governance areas that are very important that you need to think about asking. But the thing that I find that I need to reiterate is when you look at the different types of cloud, infrastructure as a service, which is this compute and storage, you as a customer of that have a lot of the technical security responsibilities. But when you think about software as a service, which is a fully baked business application out in the cloud, then really your role is more of getting that security that you need through the procurement process, through the RFPs, and by communicating your requirements. And so that's a little more challenging, but it's very important, because at the end of the day, you're the customer, and that means you're ultimately responsible from a compliance perspective, although there may be a role for the provider as well and things they're compliant to, but you can't outsource that. Okay,
great. Thanks very much, Jim.
Sure.
So now that we've talked a little bit about how to figure out which cloud vendors you can trust and some tools like the CCM and the STAR program that you can use to evaluate them, let's talk about another way to make your audits go smoothly, which is all about assessing your risk in the cloud and taking steps to address it. We're lucky to have Harold Bune here from Skyhigh Networks, and I'm going to let him weigh in on this, since he's an expert on finding out about risk in the cloud and figuring out what to do about it. Harold?
Great. Thanks a lot, Andrea. So, you know, just a brief slide or overview on Skyhigh. We're a company that provides discover and visibility capabilities for enterprise cloud usage. And so we have the ability to quickly assess what cloud services are in use and go very, very deep in terms of the security posture or overall compliance measures that an organization has taken as a service to basically ensure that they operate efficiently, or in some cases not as efficiently or effectively as they should. You know, we have over 350 customers today. Many of the Fortune 100 are using us. We have a couple Fortune 10 customers, and we have visibility across over 10 million enterprise users through our infrastructure today. That also gives us the ability to generate and track anomalous usage to a great degree. And then lastly, in cases where additional compliance measures are needed or additional controls are required based on your security and audit requirements, we can enable encryption in the cloud or additional content inspection or DLP capabilities as well. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the visibility into cloud usage and how you can use that to quickly act and assess compliance exposure or compliant, ensure that the services that you're selecting or do have in use are actually compliant. I think the first thing to do is understand what services are really in use. And typically when we go into a customer, most CIOs or CISOs and security folks think they have 50 or 70 services in use, and we typically find that the range is significantly higher than that. The bar charts on the left are basically broken out by industry vertical, and you'll see that even in some of the more heavily regulated industries, that there are in excess of 800 services on average. We have customers that have been well over 3,000 services in use based on the discovery. One vertical that actually isn't here that may be of interest is education as a vertical, or educational institutions tend to be a little bit more wide open, and they top out at around 15 or 1,600 services on average. But this is based on a risk assessment or an adoption report that we publish on a quarterly basis. We've published it for the last year and a half. That is free for download. It kind of also discusses trends that we're seeing in terms of cloud adoption. And as Jim was alluding to, the nimbleness of the cloud and the cloud-first strategy that many organizations are taking is a great way to enable the business, help end users get their jobs done, but it does carry a certain degree of risk if you have blind spots there per se. So what we do is we track over 9,000 cloud services. We leverage the cloud controls matrix very heavily from an attribute perspective, and then we've also incorporated feedback from some of the enterprise customers that we have in terms of third-party risk assessments that they have. So we'll track many attributes, and some of them are on the right. So does the service provider encrypt data at rest? Do they provide multi-factor authentication? Are they ISO 27001 certified? Other attributes come down to legal jurisdiction and intellectual property ownership, how quickly data is destroyed after a contract is terminated, to whether or not the service has been breached. So a number of different attributes at a very granular level, and we roll that up into a risk score for a service so that organizations can quickly assess, based on their audit and risk requirements, whether or not a service meets the compliance bar. So when we look at how we actually can help organizations not only accelerate kind of their audit review and ensure compliance, there's a more general use case in terms of cloud adoption, and that has more or less been broken out into these categories or uber categories of shadow IT and sanctioned IT. And based on our adoption report in our last quarterly review, the actual average across all enterprises was 831 services. But really the question is, again, how can I gain that visibility? You don't know what you don't know, and what we found is that either via web exception or inconsistencies in proxy firewall, or people who have instrumented rules to circumvent the proxy and go through the perimeter firewall directly, there are services that are in use oftentimes unbeknownst to IT and security. And so, after assessing what services are actually in use, then there's this notion of, what are the risks associated with those services? Have they been breached? We marry the information in our registry with real-time news feeds on outages, vulnerability detection, and active breach information, and really determine whether or not the service that is being used is an optimal one for the business. It may be optimal for the user. It may be acceptable for business, and really also seeing where users are self-enabling, or if there's an alternative that may be a less risky service. In terms of threat detection, we detect directionality of data in terms of inbound and outbound, as well as a unique heuristic on whether or not data is actually being exfiltrated actively to a cloud service provider. And so there have been scenarios where we've worked with large conglomerates where there was a unique data exfiltration, and videos were being uploaded to Pinterest, which would seemingly be a harmless activity, but embedded in those videos were encrypted libraries of documents. And so basically they were using Pinterest as a launch point. And so being able to look at traffic that may seemingly be harmless, but in fact actually does pose a risk to the organization. And then as we transition into sanctioned IT and as the technology stack continues to migrate to the cloud, what are additional controls that we can put in place? So from an activity monitoring and auditing standpoint, What are users doing? What are administrators within the services doing? How can we better protect the data? And in the case of certain compliance regulations or geographical jurisdiction requirements, we can actually enable encryption in an application with customer-owned keys. So if you do not like the country that a certain service provider is operating in, or if you don't trust government, or you have other security concerns in general, there are methods that we can employ to preserve the functionality of the app, preserve search, but still encrypt the data to meet compliance requirements. And then again, from a threat detection perspective, there's a number of things that we'll do in terms of activity monitoring and usage at a very granular level within the service provider, down to how many objects somebody's accessing, how many records or files they're downloading, to whether or not they've enabled something that we call impossible travel, which is appearing in 2 locations at the same time, which may indicate a compromised account, which in many ways, in the most recent Sony breach, for example, at least the initial reports believe that several accounts internally were compromised. And so there's a mechanism where we can provide some additional visibility into that.
So Harold, this is kind of startling when you think about how many possible cloud applications that people can share corporate data with. It almost seems like there's an epidemic of corporate data being shared with these external cloud applications, and we know that not all cloud applications are necessarily quote unquote bad or unsecure necessarily. But if you don't know where that data lives, you can't really verify if it's in a safe place. And I think that that's a huge struggle for IT today. One question that I have for you, as companies are trying to deal with the risks from the apps that they know about versus the ones that they don't, which one do you recommend that they tackle first?
So we have a lot of organizations that look, at the most egregious services from a risk perspective. So it's very easily in the tool to kind of rank services based on risk as well as within subcategories. So maybe, for example, people are more, there are a number of different categories, whether that be collaboration tools or cloud storage or anonymous proxies. There's a number of different ways that you can slice and dice the data. And so based on your prioritization, you could focus a specific category or focus exclusively on risk, and then determine which ones are really active in the organization, which ones are unblocked versus blocked, and then focus on a method to operationalize blocks or educational redirects for your users. That's generally a good starting point for customers, and then they quickly move to assessing business by business unit comparisons or drilling down on specific usage at a more granular transactional level if they find something that may be questionable or egregious.
Okay, that makes sense, and I think that's a good approach. Thank you.
So just some additional results that we've seen from customers in terms of security, accelerating the ability to approve services. We have one CIO, Brian Milley from Equinix, who's a customer, basically saying that he didn't want to be known as the CI no, and so he wanted to move to become the CI yes, and so part of that is really how do you accelerate the approval of services. And then what we also found from a security control standpoint is that basically it becomes a whack-a-mole game as you start to evaluate these services. And a lot of people say, well, I know the risky services and I have a web URL filter, and so I'm just going to block all this stuff. And the reality is that we find roughly 50 to 70% of cloud services being miscategorized by existing URL filters. And so there's some stuff, especially if you get a web exception, that just flows right through. And so while you play the whack-a-mole game, what we also found is that most data exfiltration in the enterprise is actually going to high-risk services. So 63% of data exfiltration is actually going to high-risk services when you play that whack-a-mole block game. And so driving a reduction in that type of data exfiltration is something that we can enable. From a cost perspective, we have a unique method to discover infrastructure as a service that's running in Amazon, Rackspace, Savvis, Terramark, Netlify, Windows Azure, and a handful of other ones. What we found is that in certain companies that have made a distinct investment in private cloud, and many times in excess of millions of dollars. In one case, we found an organization with over $3 million in spend in Amazon, while they simultaneously had invested over $10 million in the private cloud. And so it begs the question as to why you're kind of double dipping on the billing. And so the ability to drive cost reduction or consolidate on licenses Cisco is a great example where we discovered over 3,000 services in use in that organization. They quickly used our product to assess their cloud storage usage, found over 35 cloud storage services in use, used the metrics on risk and usage to prioritize down or down select to 2, and then ultimately selected a corporate standard. And then they further enabled the corporate standard by using Skyhigh to marry it to their enterprise DLP solution to inspect data as it goes to the cloud provider. Ultimately, there's a productivity bonus when users feel that they can use the tools that they want. And then obviously, from a cultural perspective, if you look at the whole bring your own device or bring your own X trend, especially with the millennials, people want access to technology and they don't want to work in a restricted environment. So there's a certain level of improved satisfaction with IT support. So bringing it back to kind of, how can you improve your compliance or responsiveness to compliance and audit? The Discover capability that we provide provides comprehensive visibility into enterprise usage for both cloud services and infrastructure, and the ability to curate your own private registry, analytics to see if anything is anomalous, as well as tracking activity, monitoring, and usage over time, and trending, so that you can demonstrate compliance. We also provide an enterprise risk score for every organization. So every organization that uses the tool gets a score, and we can demonstrate trending over time to also demonstrate compliance. And then lastly, in cases where you want additional controls or where you want to engage with a service provider that perhaps doesn't provide certain sets of controls out of the gate, we can either encrypt the data in the cloud while preserving functionality, or at least perform or enable enhanced visibility through data loss prevention and activity monitoring. And then we also have access controls where we can block certain OSs from accessing an enterprise tenant, or block certain geographies if you wanted to try to reduce your attack surface on your enterprise infrastructure running in the cloud. So hopefully that gives you a snapshot of some of the capability set that we provide and how you can enable compliance.
So Harold, I think this is a great process, and it's good to have that framework for kind of being able to find the problems and figuring out what to do about them. One quick question that I have for you, do you guys use the cloud controls matrix that Jim spoke about in your process?
Yes, we do. Yeah, we're actively engaged and work with the CSA on a regular basis, and we leverage the cloud control matrix. A portion of those attributes are in our registry, and then there's additional attributes that we track from other organizations that other organizations have basically shared with us from their own third-party risk assessments. So it's a composite, and then we roll that up into a risk score that can be customized in terms of the weightings that we apply to each of those attributes, and we also marry that to real-time information. So when certain services get breached, for example, there's alerts that can be sent out as well, or if risks or if attributes change over time, a risk level could change, and we can send out reports and alerts on that as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Harold. So step one of acing your compliance audit and ensuring security in the cloud is to know who you can trust and how to verify it. Step two, as Harold just talked about, is assessing the risk of your cloud applications and then taking the proper steps to manage that risk. And then we get into step three, which is all about putting together a culture and best practices that ensure that you're always ready for an audit no matter what. So I'm going to let Mike Pav talk about how to use audits as an opportunity to build that kind of security-focused culture. Mike has this kind of crazy idea of being able to actually love your audit, which I think is a new idea for everybody. But before we get to that, Mike, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about what Spanning does?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. So Spanning, we're a cloud-to-cloud backup vendor. We protect SaaS applications. Our primary focus so far has been around Google Apps Suite and Salesforce. We've got Office 365 coming along. And the idea is that if you've already adopted cloud services, you have business-critical data living outside of your existing firewall boundaries, you want to be able to put some kind of data protection in place for that to protect yourself against your own data loss. Not the same data loss that Harold was talking about where information is leaking out, but data loss where you actually delete or change information that you want the previous version back. Spanning gives you some capabilities in that direction. So jumping right into the audit, so as Spanning, we had to take a very strong approach towards auditing very early on because as a SaaS application that is protecting other people's data, we had to put the same kind of controls or even more rigid controls in place to ensure that we weren't a weak link in the overall data protection strategy, so that the Skyhigh guys would flag spanning as not being secure. We wanted to be a green checkbox, not a red X. Historically, audits have always been very much like a visit from the Spanish Inquisition or the stormtroopers. Happens infrequently, but when it does, it's very disruptive. Our approach was we want to be much more proactive so that it can be part of our overall culture. I'll talk a little bit about how we have done that. The first thing, and the reason that we were addressing the whole audit perspective in the first place is, shadow IT. It's always considered to be a way that information is going to leak, something that, as Harold mentioned, CI knows, want to try and shut down. And Jim even mentioned earlier that shadow IT is an indication of innovation that needs to be managed. Having some policies in place to identify what services are being used by your organization, evaluating them and making sure that your employees can use those services to be productive is kind of the focus. And the reason I bring this up is spanning occasionally shows up in a shadow IT column of evaluation. Individual users within an organization say, I want to protect my data. So we're quite sensitive to that. That's why I bring up shadow IT. So the first thing that we had to deal with, other SaaS vendors deal with, and even organizations who are adopting cloud vendors should consider is what is the culture, what are the priorities that organizations have in place? Everybody talks about the functional requirements of the applications that they build or adopt, but there are the non-functional ones around security, privacy, reliability, and availability, kind of the ilities. Those things need to be part of the everyday conversation that an organization addresses. And what we say over and over again is security is only valuable if it's meeting the needs of our end users, right? If we say that we're going to go get certified and run a certain set of security policies, but those aren't meaningful to our prospective customers, then security is of no value. Or if we're doing our own security approach and it actually doesn't meet any real standard or can't be mapped in a way that our prospective customers can understand, then again, it's of no real value. And so enter the cloud control matrix as being very helpful for us having a common language to both scope our activities and to have conversations with prospects. Moving into policy, so security is really a big set, at least from Spanning's perspective and the other SaaS vendors that we talk to, it's all about policies. How are you intending to manage the data that your application works with? Figuring out what those policies should be is reasonably straightforward. More than likely, it's a big set of things that need to be documented, a bunch of checklists and so on. Very simple things are, onboarding and exit checklists. That seems to get people confused all the time. Even within our own organization, we will sometimes have to really step back and say, what role is this employee going to fill so that we can ensure they have the appropriate access? And as they move around throughout the organization, what access patterns need to change? Password rotation is maybe the bane of every IT administrator's existence, but it's super useful. So just make sure that you do those things. And then secure coding standards. This is one that seems to trip up SaaS vendors a lot. There are a lot of ways that you can make very easy mistakes that are easy to exploit, and I'll touch on some of that in the future, but setting down upfront to say secure coding is as important as adding a new feature to the product. Those are the things that you have to write down, but then on my next slide I'll talk about writing them down is only the first part. So then you move straight into the tools and automation. You have to invest as a consumer or as a SaaS vendor into tools and automation that allow you to make sure that you're following your policies in a reliable and repeatable manner. If you rely on heroics of individuals or, hey, I'll just remember, you won't. The pace of business will just come and overwhelm you. So at Spanning, we actually build this stuff into our products, and so our product tells us that we have to go do things that require manual checks, or our product actually does a lot of the automated checks and then tells us when things don't look the way that they should have. It's an investment that can take up to 20% of overall capacity during some periods of time, but it's important because, as we keep saying, if we're storing your data and it's not secure, what's the point? So then architecture. This is where most people, especially SaaS vendors, start. They say, well, I need to make sure that I've built a secure architecture. And as I mentioned earlier, and the reason that this isn't my first slide is this is, I hate to say it, but it's the easiest piece. The hardest piece is kind of making sure that you're following all your policies. But the architecture you can get right very easily if you follow one cardinal rule, which is don't build your own secure frameworks. Go use all the information that's already available. The OWASP Top 10, that will tell you pretty much everything you need to know to get 99% down the road towards secure coding practices. Use the Cloud Control Matrix to look at what are some of the activities that my organization needs to pay attention to in order to have secure data. And even more so, use the Cloud Control Matrix as you look at your cloud vendors as well, because that gives you a common language to be able to evaluate them. Some of the other things that I have in here around automation and role-based access, it seems obvious, but it takes effort to set up, and sometimes it gets in the way of progress. But progress is only good if you can do it in a secure way. And then finally, the audit. So I would almost say that the whole intent of these practices is to ensure that you can pass your audits. But that's kind of like studying to pass the test as opposed to studying to be a well-rounded student. So you bring in this culture of ensuring that you could pass your audit on any given day so that you are reminding yourself to follow your policies and processes. The very first thing, and we've learned this by going through our SSA 16 audits, is pick your auditing firm really carefully. They're going to be a partner. You're going to spend a lot of time with them. Your business practices are not going to map directly into any of the control matrices or the SSA 16 statements of attestation that you're going to want to follow. So you have to figure out how to translate those standards into how your business works. And your auditing firm can help guide you in that direction. The second thing is store your artifacts for everything. The audit doesn't care that you say you did things correctly. It cares that you can prove that you did things the way you said you were going to do them. My great analogy is, the country is populated with speed limit signs, but yet we also still seem to get speeding tickets, right? So you have to make sure that you believe that somebody is always watching you. Always do the right thing, and that makes your audit go super easy, because at that point it's just a collection of artifact exercise, not a, oh my gosh, we forgot to go rotate passwords and we need to do it before the auditors show up in 4 minutes. And then reviewing your checklist. This is kind of the iterative approach of I've got checklists and I need to follow them, so I need a checklist that tells me I need to go check my checklists. It's a super simple technique that allows you to write down what do I think I need to do, when do I need to do it, and verify that you've done it. So kind of management 101, but everybody gets lost in the technology and the glamour of the cloud, and they forget that, you know what, you still have standard business practices you have to follow. So that kind of brings it up to the proactive audit approach. Audits can be strong, very much like a Jedi in training. You're going to go do a lot of really hard things. And the idea is that it's supposed to make you stronger and more capable, not just beat you down and slow you down. And if you approach the audit from that perspective, you really are a much stronger organization. And if you're evaluating organizations, certainly they will have statements about how we have been audited. But you want to have the non-functional conversation with them as well to get a sense of their culture. Are they putting badges on their website because they do an audit once a year and then they go back to business as usual, or is that audit really a statement of how they live their lives? And you're not going to get that directly by looking at the badges. You have to have that conversation. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. Those are some really good best practices for making a compliance audit seem, I think you said, less like an attack from the Death Star and something a little bit more manageable. So thanks very much. At this time, we'd like to open it up to some Q&A from our audience. Again, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so through the chat feature in your GoToWebinar panel. So let's take a look here. First off, here's a question that I'm going to direct to Jim. Can you tell us how many cloud applications or vendors have been evaluated against the cloud controls matrix?
Well, it's a good question that I got to give a little bit of a nuanced answer. If you go directly to our CSA Star Registry, you'll see about 100 different provider listings in there. Now, the interesting thing is that because we really ask for transparency, and particularly for the self-assessment, to post what your controls are at a high level, that there is some resistance from some providers to do that right now. It will come in from their internal legal departments, and they're concerned that, well, if we put that information online, then the Federal Trade Commission might say that's false advertising if we don't live up to all those security practices. To which my answer is, yes, that's exactly the point, is to do what you say you do. So while we have about 100 listings in there, we found that virtually every cloud provider that is somewhat of a name brand has done this work. And so if you don't, as a consumer, see them in the registry, one, you should tell them they should be in the registry, but you can always ask them to provide that same information privately. Again, we don't think that is optimal. We don't think that fits the spirit of transparency as well, but certainly you can get at the same information to help do your job.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I also have a question here for Harold, although Jim, you might have some opinions on this as well. What are some ways companies can prove compliance to auditors?
So I think one of the ways that organizations can prove compliance to auditors is operationally initiating or demonstrating that traffic is being blocked using the solution. So there's an easy way to show percentages of allowed traffic versus denied traffic in the solution. So for risky services, you could see something that was previously allowed that has been then moved into a block mode. We have integrations with existing proxy and firewall infrastructure to facilitate that in an automated fashion. And then in other scenarios with specific proxies, we also have more of a script generation process where we can generate blocks for URLs on the fly for services that we discover. That's one way. We also provide a granular view of the actually permitted and denied URLs on a per-service basis. So you can also demonstrate at a granular level all the URLs and even ban the URL that could be blocked on a service for audit purposes. And then obviously time and date range metrics and trending over time based on various measures to demonstrate a drop in approved versus unapproved services. So all of those are indicators to audit that compliance has been assured, and then just the raw level data in terms of has data been transmitted to a service provider that is unapproved is something that we can enable as well.
Okay, great.
So I think Harold had great evidentiary sorts of recommendations, and I would totally agree with that. I'd say maybe to add that you sometimes need to look at the root of trust in terms of the evidence you provide in reports, and do they need to be digitally signed and have certificates or things like that, so you can prove that they actually came from where you said they came from in the time frame you said they came from. And also, I guess I would add that in working with auditors, regulators on compliance issues, a lot of times you got to look at intent because technology moves so quickly. We know that laws, regulations, standards tend to lag the technology, and if you look at the intent, and one great example is data sovereignty, data location. So if I'm able to encrypt the information that's stored out in the cloud, yet I can hold the keys and I can prove that within my premise, does that mean that that information is actually in that other country or that other location, for example? And you could make the case that because I could destroy the key matter and that information is ciphertext and can't be read anywhere, that I am keeping control of the information inside my premises. So it's an example where that's not something that's spelled out in regulations, that type of leading edge technology, but in fact it meets the spirit of the regulation.
Okay, thanks Jim, and thanks Harold. I have one other question here that I'll direct to Mike, but Jim, you may also have some thoughts on this too. In terms of compliance, how much responsibility rests with the cloud buyer versus the cloud services provider?
Wow, that almost sounds like a bit of a loaded question. I would love to say it all goes to the buyer and the provider is just building products, but it's actually a fair balance. Obviously, the SaaS application vendor is responsible for stating, here's what we do, and then proving that they do it, and hence all of the tools that are available, and the Cloud Security Alliance, and the SSA 16 frameworks. Those are great. And so that takes a decent amount of effort from the cloud vendor's perspective. But on the consumer side, you can't just let a SaaS application enter into your overall information architecture without understanding how that fits into your global plan. So there's a couple of pieces to that. You have to understand how's my data management model going to work as I allow data to leave my firewall. But then secondarily is you need to think about, how do I evaluate how that cloud vendor fits into my overall information security architecture? So adapting your existing security audit model and understanding how it's going to have to change because technology changes and obviously the topology has changed. It's a pretty daunting effort on both sides. It's not always a one-time effort either. I wouldn't say that there are easy percentages we could offer, but I would say that you can't just enter into that conversation assuming one side is going to be 100% responsible.
Yeah, I would agree with Mike, and I think that due diligence, due care is just very important, and that's why having tools and things we've talked about to articulate all the different services you're using as well as the ones you may use. It tends to be, I guess, in the parlance of the EU data protection laws, when you talk about data processors versus data controllers, is that if you move up the stack in a software as a service application that's actually got the visibility to information and PII, they may have some more compliance responsibilities than the strictly information or infrastructure as a service, where it's the customer's responsibility to actually populate that with their data. But then also providers will have some specific domain jurisdictional issues, for example, to respond to a writ of order that may require them to turn over information. You need to understand what are the jurisdictional issues of the providers you're working with. If they've got to work with a local government for investigative purposes and they've got to provide access to keys and information like that, you certainly want to know that. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all and an easy answer to that question other than you've got to go do that investigation. And again, there's tools and technologies and a lot of information out there that we're all trying to provide for you to make intelligent, educated decisions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Mike. I think that's all for our questions. Before we wrap up, I want to tell you about some additional resources here. First of all, if you need backup for your SaaS applications like Google Apps, Salesforce, or Office 365, you can try Spanning Backup free for 14 days by visiting spanning.com. We also have a white paper called Compliance in the Cloud that we'll be sending out along with the recording of this webinar, and we would invite everyone to check that out. It's a good resource for you. Also, if you're interested in checking out any of the Cloud Security Alliance's terrific research or learning more about the Cloud Controls Matrix or the STAR program, you can do so at cloudsecurityalliance.org. And finally, our friends at Skyhigh have a special offer for all of our attendees today. If you're concerned about shadow IT or discovering and managing your risk in the cloud, Skyhigh is offering a free cloud audit. Just provide a week's worth of firewall, proxy, or SIEM logs, and they'll send you a free personalized report within 24 hours. If you're interested in finding out more about that, you can email freeassessment@skyhighnetworks.com, and that'll be terrific in helping you ferret out any of those gotchas before your next audit. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who attended today. We hope you enjoyed this discussion and found it informative. And I'd also like to thank our speakers, Jim, Harold, and Mike, for sharing their expertise and their time today. Thanks, everyone, and we'll follow up shortly with a recorded version of the webinar. Thank you.